I have the pleasure of welcoming our next presenter. It is Dr. Nina Pelikan Straus, and she will be presenting her paper called Male and Female Archetypes and the Question of Ernest Hemingway's and Virginia Woolf's Suicides. Dr. Strauss is Professor Emerita of Literature at Purchase College and a feminist literary scholar and critic. She was a founding member of the Creative Writing Program and member of the interdisciplinary Gender Studies faculty. After teaching at Purchase College for more than 30 years, she retired in 2013. Her work includes the books Dostoevsky and the Woman Question, Rereadings at the End of a Century, and more recently, the novel and neuroscience Dostoevsky to Ishiguro, which was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2025, so just last year. She has also written numerous articles on Tolstoy, Hardy, Mann, Conrad, Kafka, Kundera, Sebald, Bronte, on Freudian theory, feminist theory, and Derrida. Dr. Strauss, welcome, and I hand it over to you.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you for letting me add my little words and literary obsessions to this huge idea of what violence is. We're living in a time when we're very aware of it. So I'll begin. Well, violence expressed through suicide has engaged Virginia Woolf's and Ernest Hemingway's biographers, as well as psychoanalysts and literary critics. Later in this talk, I'll link emotional neuroscience research, such as Antonio Damasio's, to these approaches. And I'm going to do it through a little known work of Virginia Woolf's called On Illness. Woolf's and Hemingway's works come from very different cultural worlds. In Woolf's case, her dates are 1882 to 1941, from an intellectual British social milieu. In contrast, Hemingway, 1899 to 1966, emerges from a Midwestern American tradition of heroic masculinity, forged, of course, by World War I. The two writers point me to speculations about what we call sexual archetypes, which is really a kind of a Jungian theory. I don't know if I believe it, but in any case, and to the historically contextualized self-identities of novelists, both of these who depicted suicidal figures in their fictions. Perhaps no stronger contrast exists, in English at least, than in Woolf's and Hemingway's life visions, their literary styles, and their views of men and women. They disliked and criticized each other's works. Hemingway responded angrily to Woolf's critical reviews of his Men Without Women and To the Sun Also Rises. He expressed anger at dominating and intellectual women, whether towards his mother or the famous writer associated with feminism and modernism. He quoted Woolf mockingly in a letter to her, "I want to undress her publicly." Patterns of family trauma in the early 20th century leave traces in both their writings, thematized in struggles between men and women and conflicts about sex and desire. Hemingway's mother dressed him as a girl, everybody knows it, and he feared and he was angered by her dominating energy. Woolf's illness appears to have its gestation in the sexual abuse she endured by her older half-brothers at age 5 or 6. Each writer's talents illuminate for readers the ways that early childhood, sexuality, aggression, and resistance to it become displaced, I guess Freud would say sublimated in fiction, symbolically worked through, if you will, and even healed through story making. Trauma is played out and examined even as its biographical origins may be obscured. So each novelist's writing is marked by polarized images of the other sex and the return of biographical repressions, pain, that is. Feminist scholars often frame Virginia Woolf 1941 suicide as stemming from a relapse into severe mental illness, exacerbated by her long life examination of what she calls patriarchal pressure. Hemingway's suicide is related to his masculine identity, to the effects of heavy drinking, and also World War I wounds to the head. He wrote about his illness, about his injury, his pain, his depression, and his mental strain, but he did not publicly frame his condition in any psychoanalytic terms or analyze himself in an historical context, as we find in Woolf's writings. In 1929, Woolf linked women's psychology to centuries of male domination in education, family relationships, and their identity, women's identity as archetypes. I can't say this word, as the weaker sex. That'll do. It presents a stark contrast to Hemingway's homage to masculine heroism and stoicism. In A Room of One's Own, Woolf argued, some of the women here are nodding, we know it well. Well, Woolf argued that, quote, in 100 years, women will have ceased to be the protected sex, dominated by men, and that one must, she says, be woman manly or man womanly, liberated into having a room and money of one's own, to operate freely without humiliation, humiliating dependency. So Woolf narrated the contrast in that work between what she imagines as Shakespeare's sister's opportunity, lack of opportunity, in contrast to Shakespeare's. And this imagined sister Judith commits suicide, illustrating how restrictive roles for women mirror Woolf's own constraints. The focus in psycho-historical speculation, as I understand it, and I'm new to it, given this contrast and antagonism. Oh, sorry, I'm going to put this phone down. Sorry. Where was I? In contrast, yes. Woolf and Hemingway shared something together each, and that is manic depressive or bipolar illness. And how this illness contributed to their suicides, how it sculpted and even generated artistic creativity is a puzzle. How do fictional narratives and written confessions contribute to collective healing? Or do they? How does a reader's identity with a fictional character or sympathy, even if not with the author's difficult life, serve as a psychological working through, illuminating the reader's possible own conflicts? A comparison of Woolf's and Hemingway's histories opens questions about the relation of manic depression to creativity and suicide, a theme explored by Kay Jameson in Touched by Fire. Jameson argues that bipolar disorder often manifests in artistic families. She claims that poets are 30 times more likely to have manic depressive illness than the general population. Thinking about this, we, of course, reference Freud's theories of this sexual etiology of the neuroses, conflicts between homo and heterosexual tendencies leading to suffering, confusion. And finally, the importance of recent debates about the neurological, biographical, and early childhood contexts that shape, in Hemingway's case, this very hypermasculine idea of self, and in Woolf's case, a feminist sensibility and lesbianism, along with her criticisms of male-dominated culture voiced in a room of one's own into the lighthouse. The causes of bipolar disorder or manic depression offer two, at least, probably more approaches: the psychobiographical and the neuroscientific approach to the cause of symptoms, based, as you know, on very new fMRI research that indicates altered volumes of stress, sensitive limbic structures, emotional structures in the brain, such as the hippocampus and amygdala. Neuroscientists describe structural changes in frontal cortex regions, what some people call executive control, involved in regulation and impulse control, and disrupted white matter tracks that are connecting these regions. Some neuroscientists take seriously the idea that that the amygdala, the brain network responsible for fight and flight, but especially fight impulses, is larger in men than in women. Who knows? Hemingway's misogynist portrayals of women are as notorious as Woolf's homages to female characters. But misogyny mixed with longing for maternal love is also represented in Hemingway's work, which makes it poignant, which makes it powerful. These images, if you will, suggest what the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan names a language of desire that shows the way the subject is already talking to us, unknown to himself or herself, in the symbols of the symptom. I want to say it again because I am really impressed by this idea. It helps me to think about what I've thought about for so many years. What is literature? What does it do? What does it do for us? Why am I so addicted to reading novels? Okay, I'll read it again. Jacques Lacan says that there is a language of desire that shows the way the subject is already talking to us, the reader, unknown to himself, herself, in the symbols of the symptom. So Hemingway's symptom appears as an exaggerated masculinist performance of strength and courage. Through the image, for example, you all know this, the old man in the sea, alone in an open boat, pitting himself against Mother Nature and a struggling fish. I don't mean to be snide, but conquering a fish may be easier than conquering a woman. And Hemingway's male failures include the drunken Richard Gordon in To Have and Have Not, and Jake Barnes in The Sun Also Rises, whose war-inflicted impotence makes him unable to consummate his love for Brett Ashley. The novel ends, "Wouldn't it be nice to think so?" Something I always have in my head. That's a confession. Male sexuality is directly linked to cultural power in Hemingway, as the lack of it, of women's cultural power, is linked to oppression and even illness in Woolf's work. Idealizations of autonomous men without women and sexual compartmentalization are difficult to sustain through a lifetime. And in Hemingway's case, they led to 4 marriages, alcoholism, crack-ups, and eventually to suicide. An early image of Hemingway's acute anxiety occurs in his remarkable story Up in Michigan, where a young man named Jim, loaded with whiskey, takes Liz out to the dock, kisses her, and Hemingway writes, She was frightened, but she wanted it. She had to have it, but it frightened her. You mustn't do it, Jim. He rapes her, he falls asleep on her body, and she worked out from under him and started to cry. She was cold and miserable, and everything felt gone. Liz's forgiveness of this thug of a man is also, I might interpret, Hemingway's necessary fantasy. Liz took off her coat, leaned over, and covered him with it. She tucked it around him neatly and carefully. She covers up for him, and Jim rests in his obliviousness to her. That Hemingway wrote this is remarkable, especially it was, I think, his very earliest work. Hemingway's subsequent work equates facing death with male prowess. He portrays Robert Jordan's suicide and For Whom the Bell Tolls, 1940, as a deliberate, courageous act of self-sacrifice amid war's futility. Wounded, unable to escape, he grapples with the fear, but he affirms resolve. Quote, "This was the greatest gift. The ability not to ignore, but to despise whatever bad ending this could be. He knew he himself was nothing. He knew death was nothing." Very dramatic. Hemingway's male characters range from macho bullfighters and self-sacrificing warriors to male impotents, suggesting a bipolar structure that also marks Woolf's work. A disillusionment with women in one case and an ambivalence towards homosexual bonds in the other. In the most polarized terms, Hemingway's women are either nurturing, compliant, and sad, or dangerously bitchy and mannish. Feminists, of course, argue that his women are scapegoats for male insecurity, uh, uh, and other critics, mainly male, say that Hemingway's gender imagination is paradoxical rather than simply sexist. In the post-World War II period, Hemingway's strongman celebrity garnered endless photographs and articles. Cover of Life magazine, 1952. Woolf appeared, in contrast, only once in 1937 in a Man Ray photograph and a description of her work as difficult. The word difficult suggests a self-examining literary mode that Hemingway circumvented. In a 1935 letter, he described his war wounds and bullfighting adventures and his alcoholism as something that could change one's ideas and give one warmth, even if drinking wasn't so good for writing or fighting. Well, Woolf used her writing in an effort to reclaim the meaning of her illness, to transform and heal its meaning. It suggests another form of courage from Hemingway's. She was aware of Freud's theories, but she was never psychoanalyzed. She endured mental health treatments in those days, therapies, rest cures, and she records all this in her diaries. Surrounded by Bloomsbury intellectuals with numerous analytical talents who also experienced some hospitalizations and episodes of cognitive impairment, Woolf wrote about her body as an entity for contemplation. You can see I'm moving towards Damasio. I'm moving toward the new uh, uh, ideas which are gaining a lot of traction. The idea that we are not a creature of I think, therefore I am, but a creature of I feel, therefore I am. Woolf wrote in her On Being Ill, it's 1926, that sickness is not mere passivity, but a state that, quote, frees the invalid from the oppressive expectations of capitalist society and the genial pretense of having to feign wellness. Woolf complained that while literature had honored love, war, and jealousy, it had largely ignored the daily drama of the body. It's possible she was thinking of Hemingway. For her, illness reveals that the body shapes the thought, that feeling and language at every moment. She argued that English lacks an adequate vocabulary for bodily states, and she urges the need to invent new metaphors to tell the truth about my own experience as a body. She wasn't the only one who understood this about the body. One thinks of James Joyce, hello, Bob. And this more adequate vocabulary about the mind body links her to theories that did not emerge until after her death, when emotional neuroscience began to discard Descartes. Jack Pansep is important to all of this, and coins the phrase against Descartes. I feel, therefore I am. It's an idea that Woolf predictably pursues in her On Being Ill. The sickbed becomes, and I'm talking about a sickbed that is both physical and mental. It becomes a vantage point for, of course, some gifted individuals of sensory intensity and treated as both creative and terrifying. In her greatest novel, To the Lighthouse, published a year later, at least I think it's the greatest novel she wrote, Woolf pays homage to this bodily knowledge, to what she sees as maternal intelligence in ways that sharply contrast with Hemingway. Mrs. Ramsay, who's based on her image of her own mother, is metaphorized as a lighthouse, a beacon for wanderers at sea. Pausing there, she looked out to meet that stroke of the lighthouse, the long, steady stroke, until she became the thing she looked at, that light, for example, as searching, and she was beautiful like the light. Mrs. Ramsay is contrasted to Mr. Ramsay, rather amusingly, if you will, based on Woolf's father, whom Woolf mocks as obsessed with competition against greater philosophical geniuses who, as she writes, had the power to repeat every letter of the alphabet from A to Z accurately in order. Mr. Ramsay only gets to R in his philosophizing. And Woolf writes that he requires sympathy and whiskey, and someone to tell the story of his suffering to at once, who is Mrs. Ramsay. And here one might argue Woolf's polarization of male and female is structurally not unlike Hemingway's. While Hemingway seeks to overcome bodily frailty, it is the searching quality of women's embodied intelligence that Woolf prioritizes. Quote, how could one express in words these emotions of the body? Asks Mrs. Ramsay. Woolf expresses her rage against Mr. Ramsay, not directly, but through his son, James, who reacts to his father's tyranny, despotism, making people do what they did not want to do, cutting off their right to speak. In Woolf's case, narrating her anger at this patriarchal power in her novels served for many years, I believe, as working through like psychotherapy. Her strange and playful novel, Orlando, 1928, today accepted as a queer and trans literary classic, suggests a pathway towards accepting her bipolarity as linked to her bisexuality. Orlando mythologizes Woolf's one-time lover, Vita Sackville West, as a character transformed from man into woman. Very interesting work. But suicide makes its intermittent return in her novels, as it does in Hemingway's work. In The Waves, 1931, The character Rhoda contemplates disappearing into the elemental forces of water, later dies by suicide, and symbolizes this self-erasing fragility that Woolf associates with archetypal ideas of femininity. Thinking about Woolf's and Hemingway's self-inflicted violence, we have here a very complicated etiology: physical, mental illness, the return of childhood trauma that fiction can't forestall anymore, and criticism directed at both writers' last works as they became frail in body, in mind. Woolf was born in 1882, Hemingway in 1899, but they each committed suicide at similar times in their life. Woolf at 59, Hemingway at 61. After Woolf's recurrent severe depressions, the destruction of her London home in the Blitz, disappointment over reception of her her last lifetime published novel, The Years, 1940s brought Woolf experiencing raw fear that she was going mad, would not recover, would be institutionalized. She felt herself a heavy burden upon Leonard Woolf, her homosexual husband, and a great writer about colonialism, British politics. She felt herself a heavy burden, and she just was unable to recover from her crisis in a world in which hadn't given her language for bisexual, transsexual, queer theory. Would her suffering have been lessened if she lived in such a world, or was her suffering distinctly neurobiological? Her last suicide letters contains a note in the margin: "Will you destroy all my papers?" Similar to Kafka's. Both Woolf and Hemingway seem to imagine themselves embodied by their writing. And when critics noted decline in their literary prowess, each formed no other ways to struggle against the return of early childhood trauma. Hemingway's late condition also suggests that public pressure upon him to identify as this masculinist icon made him suffer. He suffered from depression, from paranoia, from cognitive decline, from heavy drinking, repeated head injuries, and people speculate some genetic illness, all of which worsened after he went to the Mayo Clinic in 1961. It didn't help him. Literary critics noticed his slipping powers. They really gave it to him, talking about him as clownish and verbose, and yet he kept publishing, trying to keep the myth of his courageous resilience alive until it failed him, until the collapse of his self-mastery became evident in his last work, Across the River, which the critic Philip Roth called egregiously bad, a drunken dictation. An ending with a return to Woolf's brilliant apprehension in her work on illness and its resonance with Antonio Damasio's core claim in his breakthrough work, Descartes' Error, and The Feeling of What Happens. He writes, "The narratives we construct, the characters and the events in the narratives, the considerations we make regarding the characters that play in these events, the emotions we attribute to these characters, and those we experience as we watch events unfold and react to them, are not independent of their organic substrate. If I have one more minute, I want to quote from To the Lighthouse, where Lily Bristow, a failed painter, understands this mind-body unity as Mrs. Ramsay's wisdom. Quote, as not inscriptions of tablets, nothing that could be written in any language known to me, but intimacy itself, which is knowledge. Through Woolf and Hemingway, I at least hope we can understand more about emotional maelstroms and failed intimacies are shaped and mastered temporarily into literary art, and how the state of the body and illness work both as a constraint and a resource, as a suffering and as a inventiveness. So to do something with my title, this focus brings us to what aligns these two very different writers in an archetype which we just might call artistic. Thank you for listening.
Nina, thank you ever so much for that presentation.